As expected, but nonetheless disappointingly, South Africa's GDP contracted in the third quarter of this year, and there are a number of issues that have contributed to the lack of growth in the country currently. ENCA Money Desk anchor Ropiwa Madzena is standing by to break down those numbers for us. Ropiwa, so this was a contraction after a number of terms of quarters where we had growth. Why? What happened?
So in the first and second quarter of this year, we had about 1.2% growth and then 1.1% growth around those regions. And that was because we were seeing an economic rebound after those harsh lockdowns were lifted by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Then the third quarter came to us, and you'll remember the country was virtually brought to its knees when we saw that violent unrest where industries across a large part of KZN and Gauteng were burnt to ashes essentially. And so it was about 2 weeks of this dire violent unrest and the looting, and then subsequently the rebuilding to us has been very difficult for these businesses, many of them opting not to open. So what happens there to us? People lose their jobs and there's no longer any money circulating within the economy, whether it be via wages and salaries or via trading and sales.
Yeah, so I mean, there are consequences to these things, and that's part of the consequences that we are realizing. Break it down for us in terms of sectors. Which sectors were key in terms of the numbers that we are seeing?
Huge drop in key sectors to us. Agriculture down 13.6%, and this is the primary sector, which 13.6%. Wow. So the primary sector, quarter on quarter, came down 5.6%. The biggest contributors, agriculture, as I've just mentioned, they're 13.6%. Mining, marginal decrease. I mean, we saw that there's been a commodity super cycle in the mining industry, so we haven't seen that much movement when it comes to wages in that particular industry. And then the secondary sector, which comprises of manufacturing, electricity and construction, not doing too well, down 3%. Electricity, quite the contributor, albeit marginally, but manufacturing to us came down 4.2%. And we know that manufacturing is one of the biggest employers in the country. That has been hampered, I just saw earlier on, by our export. Our export numbers went down significantly because our manufacturers couldn't work. That was one component, electricity and other inhibitants, but also the backlog at our ports having a huge impact on that supply chain that we have in the country.
Doesn't that talk to what the South Africa Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Program is meant to be about, and that other plan that had emanated from National Treasury, whose name I really don't know, but I assume much of it was incorporated into the SAERRP. Doesn't that talk to it, the whole issue of, pipeline industries? If you open the veins and arteries that feed production further down the line, actually you can get this economy moving. So things such as electricity, water, infrastructure, those kinds of things. Doesn't it come back to that? So I guess I'm asking, are there any ideas really on how to get growth then going?
Yeah, so the problem, we could have as many ideas that we can have to us, but if the institutions are not able to implement those ideas, that's the big problem. We talk about providing electricity and water. We don't have electricity supply that is sufficient enough, and it's taken so long for IPPs to become part of the grid or to create their own power generation. So that process has been slow. Water issues, we've got water infrastructure that's collapsing, and of course the transports, the rails, the ports. There's a monopoly via Transnet, and only recently the Transnet opened up its railways to private sector operators, something that should have been done, and it's been argued maybe decades ago, just to break down the monopoly. So you're asking a question about, are there any ideas? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of ideas to us. The failing part here is our institutions, who are unable to help us implement those ideas.
And I suppose when you get these numbers, Ropiwa, it all comes together as part of a puzzle, because occasionally we report that Transnet has declared force majeure because of some disturbance, I don't know, at Richards Bay or whatever at the port of Durban, and or there's been this incident, a cyber attack or something, and we never look at it as part of the bigger picture that then comes up and gets reported in reports such as these GDP numbers.
That's absolutely right. The supply chain issues are critical to the way in which our growth happens in this country. As I mentioned, one of our biggest sectors, the automotive sector, we rely heavily on exports because our domestic market has virtually been depressed. Even before the pandemic, domestic car sales were not happening, but we were benefiting from automotive parts being exported to our biggest market, which is Europe, and that was inhibited partly because of COVID, but also because of those issues that you've just mentioned at Transnet, cyber attack issues, the force majeures because of fires and the like. And so those issues really inhibit that movement, and because they are not resolved at an efficient pace, we don't see that movement happening, and that filters through into overall GDP growth, at least for the third quarter that we're seeing now.
And goodness knows we need growth, right? I mean,
absolutely.
It will be critical to see what happens in the fourth quarter, because it will determine then overall what the year looked like.
Absolutely, and it's the only way to create jobs. Growth is the only way to create jobs to us.
All right, Ropiwa, I can keep talking and talking and talking endlessly with you. All right, thank you for coming through. ENCA's Ropiwa Madzena there, giving us a sense of what has happened. As you see at the bottom of your screen there, the news around GDP, quarter 3. The numbers not looking good.